Hello. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, whether from the United States, Brazil, or another country, welcome. Before we delve into the secrets of Amityville, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any stories full of mystery, suspense, and surprising revelations. We want you to be part of this community, commenting on where you're watching from and which part of the story intrigued you the most. Now get ready to discover the truth behind one of the most enigmatic houses in the United States, where decades of secrets have finally come to light. Night fell over Amityville, a small town known for its tree-lined streets and old houses, some with decades of silent history. Among them, the house on Ocean Street, seemingly ordinary to any unsuspecting neighbor, hid secrets that no police report could fully capture. It was the home that years before had been the scene of events that shocked the nation, but the details were always fragmented, shrouded in rumors and contradictory versions. For James Miller, an investigative journalist newly arrived in town, that seemingly harmless facade had the kind of aura that intrigued more than it frightened. James wasn't interested in sensationalism. He sought facts, documents, and above all, the truth behind stories that no one dared to touch. His arrival coincided with a wave of murmurs from longtime residents, people who avoided looking directly at the house, as if the structure itself carried a weight that couldn't be explained with words. As James passed through the creaking gate of the property, he felt a familiar sensation, the silent unease that precedes important discoveries. The garden was neglected, with tall lawns and shrubs covered in dry leaves, and the air carried the damp smell of old wood mixed with a hint of metallic rust, something he couldn't quite identify. Inside the house, each room seemed suspended in time, as if life had stopped on the morning of an event no one openly discussed. Old paintings with dusty frames displayed faces of people James had never met, but who seemed to observe him with silent attention. The furniture was intact, but a slight misalignment of the objects suggested that someone had been there recently, even though no one had lived in the house for years. The antagonist of the story, unbeknownst to James, was not just one person, but the collection of untold stories, hidden documents, burned or lost diaries, the town's own selective memory. There was also an eccentric neighbor, Richard Holloway, who watched James's every move with penetrating, alert eyes, always keeping a certain distance, as if his intentions were as enigmatic as the house itself. Richard knew the history of Amityville better than any police file, but his words were laden with tension, threatening to both inform and confuse. "Some things," he said one afternoon, leaning against the wooden fence that divided the properties, "are better left buried. You'll find out sooner or later, and then there'll be no going back." James felt the weight of that warning, but he didn't back down. He knew that to reveal the truth, he would have to face resistance, pressure, and perhaps direct threats. As he walked through the house's corridors, he found locked doors, drawers sealed with old locks, and a basement whose rust marks suggested decades of isolation. Each step echoed as if the house itself were breathing, and the journalist began to realize that past events had left an invisible mark, capable of affecting anyone who dared to probe its secrets. The main conflict was beginning to take shape. James versus the silence of the city, the selective amnesia of witnesses, the implicit hostility of neighbors who did not wish to revisit painful memories, and, above all, the resistance of a house that seemed unwilling to reveal its history. Each document found, each account heard in whispers, brought more questions than answers. The central mystery lay precisely in the gap between the known facts and the true events, hidden for decades under layers of fear, shame, and vested interests. The initial suspense deepened when James discovered an old letter hidden behind a family portrait. The yellowed paper bore trembling, hurried handwriting, describing events that, if true, challenged all known versions of the Amityville tragedy. Without naming names, the letter pointed to cover-ups, manipulations, and veiled threats against anyone who tried to investigate. James felt a chill as he realized he had crossed an invisible line, and that the search for the truth was not merely a journalistic investigation. It was a direct confrontation with human forces determined to keep secrets buried. By the end of the introduction, the atmosphere was thick with tension, anticipation, and doubt. The reader realized that the story wasn't just about an old house in Amityville, but a complex web of human actions, omissions, and secrets that shaped the present as much as the past. James, driven by curiosity and the conviction that the truth should be exposed, began a journey that would offer no easy returns and that would transform his perception of the town, its inhabitants, and even himself. Each step inside the house was not merely physical but symbolic, a gradual plunge into an enigma that, if solved, could forever change the understanding of Amityville. The town of Amityville, though small, carried a history marked by change and silent secrets. Its narrow streets and colonial houses maintained an appearance of tranquility, but each resident seemed to carry a selective memory, a fragment of the past they preferred not to mention. James began to explore the town not only as a journalist, but as someone trying to understand the behavioral patterns of a community that, while proud of its peaceful appearance, hid stories that no one dared to tell. He visited the local library, an old building with dark wood shelves and the smell of aged paper, where he could access newspapers, civil records, and old archives about Ocean Street and its residents. He discovered that the building, more than just an address, was a point of convergence for intertwined family stories, discrete rivalries, and social conventions that maintained the collective silence. Among the secondary characters, Sarah Green stood out, a former neighbor of the house's original family. Sarah was a middle-aged woman, careful-spoken, with eyes that seemed to scan the past, and a natural skepticism that couldn't be ignored. Despite initial reluctance, she began to provide crucial details about the lives of the former residents, small observations about habits and behaviors that seemed banal, but which, when combined, revealed patterns of tension and concealment. Sarah described silent dinners, family gatherings interrupted by uncomfortable glances, and frequent visits from people no one remembered exactly who they were. Each account increased the complexity of the mystery and built additional layers onto the main narrative, showing that the conflict was not isolated to the house, but to how an entire community reacted to events it preferred to ignore. James also began to explore the personality of his eccentric neighbor, Richard Halloway. Unlike Sarah, Richard seemed to live on a threshold between curiosity and obsession, observing James's every move with intense attention, but never offering information directly. He became a subtle antagonist, not through violent actions, but through psychological resistance and the power of misinformation. Richard knew details of the city, had access to forgotten files, and seemed to have an almost photographic memory of events that others tried to hide. His constant presence, in silence or in cutting comments, pressured James to think twice about every step, every interview or discovery he decided to publish. The journalist realized that to uncover the truth, he would need not only documents and testimonies, but also to understand the psychological dynamics of people who felt fear or shame about a past that should never have come to light. The setting also took on an active role in the narrative. The seasons, the coastal winds of Long Island, the feeling of isolation on dimly lit streets at night. Everything contributed to the atmosphere of tension and mystery. Every detail of the city influenced decisions. Discreet meetings in secluded cafes, the need to consult files at specific times to avoid unwanted attention, or the constant observation of neighbors who appeared and disappeared as if they knew exactly what James was investigating. The house on Ocean Street, with its old walls, silent rooms, and an inaccessible basement, served as the epicenter of the plot. But it was the interaction between the characters and the cultural context that transformed each discovery into an emotional, intellectual, and social challenge. While exploring, James realized that the city possessed overlapping layers of history, old families trying to maintain their reputations, unfinished police investigations, financial secrets, and broken relationships that had been ignored to preserve a facade of normalcy. These elements not only enriched the plot, but also provided plausible motivations for each character, showing that the journalist's obstacles were not artificial, but a natural consequence of a society that protects secrets. Each interaction with Sarah, Richard, or other residents added nuances to the main conflict, making James's investigation an almost tactical experience. He needed to combine observation, patience, and intuition to advance, while the secondary characters, with their own agendas, influenced the pace and direction of the narrative. At the end of this exploration, the reader begins to realize that Amityville is not just a place, but a living organism shaped by secrets, memories, and complex human interactions. The world and its characters intertwine organically, establishing the basis for the conflict that will soon intensify. James, now more aware of the context, the local culture, and the personalities around him, finds himself on the threshold between discovery and danger, prepared to face the challenges that will arise in the development of the central conflict. As James deepened his investigation, the conflict began to intensify inescapably. With each file he found in the library or each testimony obtained from reluctant residents, new contradictions emerged, clues that not only challenged what he knew, but also threatened his own safety. The letter found in the house on Ocean Street, which seemed like just a fragment of information, began to connect with official documents, revealing inconsistencies that could not be ignored. Local authorities, former detectives, and residents who had once collaborated to clarify the facts now appeared as silent obstacles, responding with evasions, convenient forgetfulness, or suspicious glances that made it clear there was a line James should not cross. Richard Holloway's antagonism became more evident at this point. He began to follow James discreetly, appearing in cafes, the library, and even on busy streets, never approaching him directly, but conveying the feeling that the journalist's every move was being monitored. There was something calculated in his actions. Richard not only knew the history of the city and the house, but seemed to possess privileged information about every step James took. When confronted directly, his stance became ambiguous, offering incomplete clues that led to more questions than answers, a constant tension that tested the protagonist's patience and determination. Meanwhile, Sarah Green revealed more details, but in a fragmented and cautious manner. She mentioned nighttime visits by unknown people to the house decades ago, encounters that seemed harmless at first glance, but which, when combined with old records, suggested an intentional cover-up of activities that could expose not only the original family, but influential members of the community. The tension increased as James realized that this was not just a journalistic investigation. He was dealing with a web of interests, omissions, and personal secrets that kept the entire town silent. Each discovery brought him closer to the truth, but also increased the risk of direct or indirect confrontations with those who wished to keep the facts buried. The setting, in turn, began to directly interfere with the protagonist's actions. Deserted streets at night, shadows cast by ancient trees, creaking doors in empty hallways. Everything contributed to the feeling that James was not only discovering the history of Amityville, but was part of a narrative that involved him emotionally and physically. On a rainy night, upon returning home, he found signs of forced entry, drawers ransacked, and objects out of place, as if someone had made it clear they were watching. There were no direct confrontations, but the message was clear. The truth had a price, and it would not be given up without resistance. The complexity of the conflict increased with the introduction of a new character, Laura Benson, a former employee of the original family who now lived in silence, avoiding any contact with the press or neighbors. Laura possessed intimate details about the events that had occurred in the house, information that could confirm or refute theories and records, but her reluctance to cooperate made the investigation even more challenging. She added emotional layers to the narrative, revealing personal fears, guilt, and moral dilemmas that not only complicated James's work, but also humanized the characters involved, showing that the conflict was not merely external, but deeply rooted in complex human relationships. The unfolding conflict also brought practical and unexpected obstacles: missing files, changing witnesses, altered or omitted documents, and the challenge of separating facts from rumors amplified by decades of hearsay. Each obstacle demanded creativity, persistence, and a people-reading ability from James that he hadn't needed before. The interactions between James, Richard, Sarah, and Laura created a web of tension where every action had immediate repercussions, and any misstep could compromise not only the investigation but their personal safety. The suspense reached a critical point when James found an old photograph hidden between the pages of a dusty book. In it, figures who should have been irrelevant to the case appeared in what seemed to be a secret meeting, with details that only a thorough investigation could explain. The implicit revelation indicated that what had happened in the house on Ocean Street was connected to larger interests, possibly involving influential people in the city and manipulated historical records. This discovery not only broadened the scope of the investigation, but solidified the main conflict. James was not dealing merely with the secrets of a house, but with a system of omissions that could threaten the entire community's perception of Amityville's own history. At the end of the conflict's development, the reader realizes that the tension lies not only in the discoveries, but also in the consequences of each of the protagonists' actions. The plot grows in layers, uniting complex characters, an environment laden with meaning, and real obstacles, creating a continuous feeling that the truth has a weight that transcends the simple recounting of events. James finds himself surrounded by ethical dilemmas, silent threats, and the need to discern the reality behind appearances, establishing the groundwork for the subplots and complexities that will emerge in the next stage of the narrative. As the investigation progressed, James began to realize that the Amityville mystery wasn't limited to the house itself, but branched out into subplots that revealed the complexity of the town and the human relationships involved. One of these secondary threads involved former neighbors who seemed to harbor discreet grudges or silent family rivalries. He discovered, for example, that the original family of the house had financial and personal ties with other families in the town, relationships that had been buried to preserve reputations. The revelation of small betrayals, unpaid loans, and property disputes added layers to the main narrative, showing that the resistance to revealing the truth had concrete motivations, not just fear of the supernatural or scandal. Meanwhile, Laura Benson, who had previously kept her distance, began sending anonymous messages to James, sharing fragments of information. Some were enlightening, others deliberately enigmatic, but all introduced new complexities to the story. She described events that seemed insignificant at first glance: nighttime encounters, hushed discussions, objects moved. But when combined with old documents and Sarah's testimony, they created a web of connections that James needed to decipher. Each fragment increased the pressure, forcing him to work quickly, while remaining careful not to become a target for observers who did not want the truth to come to light. Another element of complexity emerged with Richard Holloway himself. His silent presence intensified into more subtle actions, such as intercepted phone calls, the suggestion of prearranged meetings to confuse and test James, and partially true information that forced the journalist to carefully separate fact from manipulation. Psychological tension became a central component, showing that the conflict was not merely physical or documentary, but emotional and strategic. Richard represented the force resisting disclosure, while James needed to decipher intentions, patterns, and motivations without ever losing control of the investigation. The urban setting also began to directly influence these subplots. The narrow streets of Amityville, with their guarded houses and silent alleys, created opportunities for unexpected encounters, discreet pursuits, and silent observations. One night, James realized he was being followed by an unknown figure while walking to a meeting with Sarah. The sound of footsteps alternated with the noise of rain and wind in the trees, and the tension reached an almost unbearable point. This type of event introduced a sense of time pressure, as every decision needed to be quick, precise, and safe, reinforcing the urgency of the investigation and the risk of immediate consequences. The subplots also explored the personal relationships and internal conflicts of the secondary characters. Sarah Green, for example, grappled with guilt for not reporting suspicious events in the past, while Laura faced fears of retaliation for revealing information that could compromise influential people. Richard, although an antagonist, displayed unexpected layers of motivation, a mixture of obsession with control, fear of exposure, and a strange loyalty to family traditions that kept secrets intact. These complexities enriched the story, as each character brought their own dilemmas that interacted organically with the central conflict. Time pressure intensified when James discovered that certain official files were about to be transferred to permanent storage, rendering some evidence inaccessible. He needed to act quickly to secure copies and records before they disappeared forever. This race against time added urgency to the subplots, connecting them directly to the main storyline and increasing the risk of mistakes or dangerous encounters. Every wrong step could reveal his presence or alert those who preferred to keep the secrets buried. By intertwining these subplots, the story becomes more complex and engaging. The reader realizes that Amityville is not just the setting for an investigation, but a social organism where secrets, fears, and interests collide. Each secondary character, each seemingly minor event, contributes to building tension and suspense, preparing the ground for the turning point that will significantly change the direction of the narrative. The subplots not only complement the main conflict, but also deepen the reader's understanding of the characters' motivations, vulnerabilities, and resilience, making the search for truth a challenge that transcends documents and evidence. It is about deciphering a network of human relationships that shaped the history of the town. The following morning, James received an anonymous phone call, a distorted voice whispering only vague instructions. If you really want the truth, go to the basement today, but be prepared for what you will see. The warning, though enigmatic, carried enough weight to quicken his heart and intensify the sense of urgency. Until then, the basement of the house on Ocean Street had been merely a mysterious, inaccessible space, symbolic of the secret the town seemed to protect for decades. Now it was becoming the epicenter of an inevitable revelation, a breaking point that would change everything James thought he knew about Amityville. As he descended the creaking wooden steps, carrying a flashlight and a briefcase, he realized something was different. The air was heavier, damper, and permeated with an almost palpable sense of abandonment and surveillance. Each step echoed, and the flashlight's beam highlighted walls with cracks, old marks, and symbols he hadn't noticed before, signs that someone had manipulated the space to hide not only objects, but memories and evidence. In the background, a metal door that seemed sealed for decades displayed recent signs of rust being removed, as if it had been opened and closed by unknown hands in recent days. James felt a mixture of excitement and fear, aware that he was about to discover something that could not be undone. Inside the basement, he found a set of old boxes, carefully organized and labeled with dates referring to the weeks leading up to the well-known tragedy. Among the papers, photos, and diaries, James noticed something disturbing. Official documents had been altered to cover up the presence of influential people from the city in the house during the critical events. Furthermore, the initial letter he had found years before was not an isolated fragment, but part of a complex network of records connecting local authorities, former residents, and even members of the media in an attempt to keep certain facts secret. The revelation changed the nature of the investigation. It was no longer just about understanding the history of the house, but about dismantling a system that distorted the truth to protect its own interests. Tensions rose when James discovered a diary belonging to Richard Halloway, the neighbor who until then had remained an indirect antagonist. The diary, hidden in one of the boxes, revealed that Richard had acted as the keeper of the secret for decades, ensuring that no compromising details were exposed. Richard's motivations now took on another dimension. It wasn't just control or obsession, but a combination of fear of repercussions and distorted loyalty to an unwritten code that protected certain families. James understood that the antagonist was not just someone who opposed the investigation, but a crucial link to understanding the full complexity of the Amityville story. While examining the records, a sudden noise made him raise his flashlight quickly. Someone was in the basement, moving silently among the shadows. James froze, realizing he had underestimated the surveillance. It was Laura Benson, who had finally decided to face her fear of exposure to deliver information directly to the journalist. She carried additional documents, old letters, and confidential records that confirmed James's suspicions about file manipulation and the cover-up of critical events. Laura's entrance changed the turning point. The story was no longer just a search for clues, but a race against time and against those who still wanted to keep the truth hidden. The turning point came when James realized that one of the documents included details of a conspiracy involving not only the well-known tragedy, but also plans to divert resources, alter police reports, and silence witnesses. The Amityville narrative, so often repeated and sensationalized, was just the tip of the iceberg. The true story involved calculated human decisions, manipulation of evidence, and deliberate silences that affected not only the house on Ocean Street, but the entire community. The magnitude of the discovery left James stunned. He had crossed the line between journalistic curiosity and moral responsibility, now carrying the truth that many wanted to remain buried forever. At the turning point, the reader realizes that the direction of the story has completely changed. The conflict ceases to be merely a mysterious investigation and transforms into a confrontation between James and a network of interests that manipulates information, people, and memories. The subplots converge clearly. The secondary characters, Sarah, Laura, and Richard, gain decisive roles, and the Amityville environment becomes a stage for tension, danger, and revelations that defy all expectations. The next step will be to explore the immediate consequences of this discovery, the impact on relationships, and the reactions of those who now find themselves exposed by the protagonist's work. Emerging from the basement, James felt the weight of the newfound truth, as if each step carried decades of silence and omission. The impact wasn't merely emotional. He now possessed information capable of shaking reputations, altering historical perceptions, and placing powerful people in delicate situations. Each step through the house on Ocean Street seemed to echo the past, reminding him that his actions were not isolated. The city's atmosphere, once just a shadow of mystery, had now become an active force. Suspicious glances appeared in windows and doorways, and the silent movements of the neighbors indicated that his presence had been noticed, making confrontation with those who had benefited from the collective silence inevitable. Sarah Green reacted with a mixture of relief and fear. With each detail revealed by James, she recognized truths she had kept hidden for years, and the weight of guilt seemed to lessen as the narrative came to light. However, she also perceived risks. Divulging information could affect her own life, as well as that of longtime relatives in the city. The conversations between James and Sarah became strategic, with each decision needing to consider not only the accuracy of the facts, but also the safety of those involved. The dynamic between them changed. From a relationship of witnessing and guidance, it became a cautious collaboration where trust and prudence defined each step. Richard Halloway, upon discovering that James and Laura had accessed records he considered protected, became more proactive, not through direct confrontations, but through actions that tested the journalist's patience and resilience. He manipulated small situations to induce errors, pressuring James to make quick decisions at the risk of exposure. Every gesture of Richard's, even the subtlest, carried a clear message. The truth would have a price, and he was prepared to ensure that no one violated the silent pact that held the city together under a facade of normalcy. The psychological tension grew, making every move of James calculated, every encounter measured, every decision laden with immediate consequences. Laura Benson, on the other hand, proved to be an indispensable ally. Her courage in exposing herself brought clarity to the facts, but also introduced personal and ethical risks. By sharing confidential information and essential documents, she placed herself in a vulnerable position, making the narrative more complex. Her presence brought new challenges. James needed to balance the speed of the investigation with the protection of those who were now directly involved. The reactions of the secondary characters reflected the magnitude of the turning point. Each revelation triggered consequences that went beyond simple knowledge, affecting personal relationships, reputations, and the emotional stability of everyone involved. In the urban environment of Amityville, the repercussions became visible. Small warning signs, furtive encounters, and rumors began to spread. James realized that the impact of his discoveries was not limited to the house or the old files. The entire city was reacting, consciously or unconsciously, to the changes brought about by the emerging truth. The narrative gained momentum. Each document, each testimony, each interaction began to generate new ramifications, making it impossible for James to maintain emotional or practical distance from the consequences of his investigation. Internally, James also faced personal conflicts. The responsibility of possessing the truth placed him in a dilemma: how to reveal facts that could hurt innocent people or put lives at risk. At the same time, he knew that withholding information would be tantamount to betraying his own journalistic ethics. This moral tension increased the complexity of the narrative, showing that the conflict was not only external, but also deeply rooted in individual choices, unexpected consequences, and the constant struggle between justice and prudence. As the consequences accumulated, the reader realized that the Amityville conflict transcended the initial mystery. The characters' actions reflect how hidden truths, past decisions, and silent omissions shape not only the present, but the collective perception of an entire community. The turning point not only exposed secrets, but reconfigured relationships, redefined alliances, and created a new tension that demanded quick, strategic, and conscious responses. Each character reacts according to their motivations, limits, and fears, setting the stage for the upcoming challenges that will test the protagonist's ability to overcome obstacles and transform the investigation into a journey of learning, courage, and resilience. With the weight of the discoveries about the truth of Amityville, James felt he needed not only to investigate, but to transform himself to cope with the impact he now carried. Every decision demanded courage, precision, and a growing ability to interpret subtle warning signs. He realized he could no longer act merely as a detached journalist. He needed to anticipate movements, understand motivations, and protect those who, like Laura and Sarah, had exposed themselves to help him. James's personal growth became visible in his actions. He no longer merely reacted to events, but strategically planned each step, analyzing possibilities, preparing for confrontations, and above all, learning to trust his own intuition. The antagonist, Richard Halloway, remained present, but his effect had changed. Previously a silent threat, he now represented a challenge that James needed to overcome with intelligence and patience. Instead of direct confrontations, there were battles of strategy and information interpretation, misleading letters, unexpected encounters requiring quick responses, false clues scattered to test his resilience. Each obstacle imposed by Richard demanded that James learn to remain calm under pressure, assessing risks and consequences without succumbing to fear or impatience. The ability to stay focused in the face of tension became a clear mark of his growth. Laura Benson, in turn, solidified her position as an ally, but also brought new challenges by requiring James to balance his own safety with protecting hers. On several occasions, he had to improvise, creating strategies to gather information without exposing her, using documents, records, and discreet meetings to advance the investigation. This care demonstrated a transformation in the protagonist's attitude. From an investigator driven by curiosity and determination, he began to act with empathy, awareness, and responsibility, understanding that the actions he took would directly affect the lives of others. James's growth was also reflected in his ability to understand human complexity. He came to interpret nuances in the behaviors of Sarah, Laura, and even Richard, recognizing that seemingly irrational or hesitant decisions were often responses to invisible fears, loyalties, or pressures. This understanding allowed James not only to predict moves, but also to build temporary alliances and take advantage of moments of vulnerability or doubt in others, making his investigation more efficient and safe. The challenges of the urban environment and the house on Ocean Street itself continued to test his skills. Creaking stairs, dark corridors, doors that slammed shut unexpectedly, and delicate documents demanded attention, care, and dexterity. Every practical action became an exercise in overcoming obstacles. James needed to move silently, protect evidence, decipher codes, and interpret signs, always remaining aware of the risk of being observed or deceived. This physical setting became an extension of the protagonist's psychological growth, the ability to navigate space, understand patterns, and anticipate dangers directly reflected his inner development. Learning also occurred in his relationships with the other characters. James realized he could trust Laura and Sarah, but that he needed to guide them in a way that his own decisions wouldn't compromise anyone. Cooperation became strategic. Each meeting, each exchange of information, and each plan reflected maturity, leadership skills, and emotional control. He learned to measure words, intentions, and actions, transforming a simple investigation into a collective effort with more precise and reliable results. This growth culminated in James's ability to face critical moments without losing focus or integrity. When confronted with information that could shake his confidence, he maintained clarity of purpose. Instead of being overwhelmed by doubt or fear, he reacted with conscious action, solving problems creatively and confidently. This development became perceptible to the reader. James was no longer just an investigator. He had become someone capable of transforming challenges into learning, threats into strategy, and discoveries into concrete action. By the end of this stage, James had evolved from a determined but isolated journalist into a protagonist capable of facing not only external obstacles, but also internal dilemmas and emotional risks, keeping the narrative focused on action and continuous evolution. The protagonist's personal growth sets the perfect stage for the next topic, in which secondary subplots will be resolved and the main conflict will approach its climax, maintaining the intense pace and high suspense. With James consolidating his progress, the pace of the investigation accelerated. Every step was calculated, every decision had immediate consequences, and subplots that had previously seemed secondary began to converge on a central point. Laura continued to provide critical information, but now her actions were strategically coordinated. Files were secretly analyzed, records checked against public documents, and meetings planned to avoid Richard's silent surveillance. The tension increased as each character realized that time to act was running out. The risk of exposure, error, or unexpected confrontations made every move vital. Meanwhile, Sarah Green faced personal dilemmas that tested her courage. The pressure of sharing details that could put former residents or family members in a precarious situation forced her to choose between personal protection and commitment to the truth. Her interaction with James evolved. Initially just a guide and witness, she became a strategic collaborator, using her knowledge of the history and the city to anticipate obstacles, map safe routes, and suggest paths James hadn't considered. This collaboration made the narrative more dynamic, showing that the resolution of the subplots depended on teamwork and trust between the characters. Richard Holloway intensified his activity in an almost invisible way. Small signs of his presence appeared in every action: doors closing on their own, objects changing places, intercepted phone calls, everything suggesting that he was monitoring James and his strategies. This constant pressure increased the tension, forcing the protagonist to act with precision and speed. Every decision James made now had to take into account not only the collection of information, but also the protection of allies and the maintenance of his own safety. The antagonist became a force that even silently shaped every step of the narrative, making the environment unpredictable and dangerous. The secondary subplots also began to resolve themselves organically. Old information about family rivalries, financial disputes, and historical omissions, which previously diverted the focus of the investigation, were integrated into the main conflict. James managed to connect clues that, in isolation, seemed insignificant, but which together revealed clear patterns of manipulation and cover-up. Each partial resolution brought clarity, but also new questions, preparing the ground for the maximum tension of the climax. The pace of the narrative accelerated, keeping the reader attentive to every detail and creating anticipation about how the characters will face the final challenges. In the physical setting, the house on Ocean Street and the streets of Amityville played a decisive role. Narrow passages, dark corridors, old doors, and creaking staircases were not just obstacles, but tools that James strategically used to advance the investigation and protect allies. On a night of heavy rain, he and Laura had to escape a silent pursuit, using their knowledge of the environment to stay out of reach. This type of scene reinforced the sense of urgency and created increasing tension, preparing the reader for the final confrontation that will define the story's outcome. The protagonist's focus also shifted to integrating the information obtained. Each document, letter, diary entry, and testimony needed to be analyzed, combined, and verified to ensure nothing was misinterpreted. James began to assemble a cohesive narrative that linked all the subplots to the central conflict, transforming fragmented information into a clear picture of manipulation, secrets, and conspiracies. This stage of preparation for the climax reinforced the protagonist's active role, showing that James's personal growth now translated into strategic action and critical thinking. By the end of the preparation, all the pieces were in place. James had allies, crucial information, an understanding of the environment, and an awareness of the antagonist. The subplots had been resolved or integrated into the main plot. Each character was ready to act according to their motivations, and the narrative tension reached an almost unbearable point. The reader realizes that the climax will not just be an action sequence, but the inevitable confrontation between truth and silence, courage and fear, planning and improvisation, where each decision will have a direct impact on the story's outcome. The atmosphere in Amityville was tense that night. A fine rain trickled down the deserted streets, and the house on Ocean Street seemed to pulse with every step James took. He knew that the final confrontation wouldn't just be physical or documentary. It would be a test of strategy, courage, and intelligence. Every detail of the environment was now crucial. The position of the doors, the fragility of the stairs, the shadows cast by the flickering lights, everything could alter the course of events. Upon entering the main room, James found Richard Halloway waiting, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the tension in the air. There were no shouts, only the heavy silence that foreshadowed the inevitable confrontation. Richard, though an antagonist, now displayed signs of vulnerability. He knew that the actions of James, Laura, and Sarah had cornered his scheme, and that the secrets he had protected for decades were about to be exposed. A firm look between the two marked the beginning of the climax. It wasn't just words or threats, but the accumulated weight of years of silence, manipulation, and fear concentrated in a single instant. The confrontation intensified when James presented documents and evidence he had gathered. Every paper, every photo, every diary entry showed that Richard could no longer control the narrative. The evidence was irrefutable. Manipulations, cover-ups, and calculated decisions to keep the city in the dark were now exposed. Richard tried to react, questioning the validity of some information, but James, prepared and confident, dismantled each argument with clarity. It was more than a power struggle. It was a battle of intelligence and precision, where every action determined the final outcome. Meanwhile, Laura and Sarah provided strategic support. They maintained vigilance, alerted to suspicious movements, and protected critical evidence. The coordination between the characters, a result of James's growth and learning, became crucial. There was no room for error. Every decision Richard made was monitored, anticipated, and neutralized, showing that the climax depended not only on direct confrontation, but also on the protagonist's ability to integrate allies, information, and environment into a cohesive strategy. Tension reached its peak when Richard attempted an unexpected maneuver, an attempt to destroy physical evidence James had gathered over months. A moment of chaos filled the room. Papers flew, flashlights fell, and the sound of rain mingled with hurried footsteps. James reacted instinctively, protecting documents and guiding Laura to safety while decisively confronting Richard. Each movement reflected the personal growth he had achieved: agility, intelligence, courage, and an understanding of the consequences of each action. The final twist came when Sarah revealed a detail James hadn't yet noticed. A secret copy of official records had been stored off-site, ensuring that even if the worst happened, the truth could be preserved. This information shifted the balance of the confrontation. Richard, realizing his last weapon had been neutralized, lost his composure, and finally confronted the reality that his efforts to keep the secret had failed. The climax reached its emotional and strategic peak, demonstrating that collective intelligence, preparation, and courage had overcome decades of manipulation and fear. In the final moments, James managed to gather all the evidence, neutralize the obstacles imposed by Richard, and ensure the integrity of the information. The house, the stage for so many secrets, now became a symbol of revelation. Each character reflected on the impact of their actions. Richard confronted defeat and the need to face the consequences. Laura understood the power of courage and calculated exposure, and Sarah realized that the truth, though painful, liberated both the city and herself. The climax not only resolved the central tension, but also solidified James's transformation. He was no longer just an investigator driven by curiosity. He had become someone capable of planning, protecting, leading, and acting with precision under pressure. The plot twists were plausible. Each action had a direct consequence, and the conflict resolution was unique, reinforcing the intense and satisfying narrative. At this point, the reader experiences a mixture of tension, relief, and wonder at the story's complexity. The subplots are integrated. The antagonist has confronted his limitations, and the protagonist has demonstrated tangible growth, setting the perfect stage for the conclusion and epilogue, where the impact of the actions will be fully revealed. The calm that followed the climax brought a strange feeling to Ocean Street. The rain had stopped, but the weight of the truth lingered in the air. James watched the now silent house, aware that every action taken had changed not only his own life, but the lives of everyone involved. The evidence gathered, the secrets revealed, and the courage of Laura and Sarah had exposed decades of manipulation and cover-up, transforming Amityville from a place of mystery into a scene of undeniable truth. Richard Holloway, defeated and confronted with the consequences of his decisions, retreated before the reality he could no longer control. His posture changed. From a threatening figure, he became someone who needed to face his choices and accept responsibility for years of silence. Richard's defeat was not only a practical victory for James, but also a symbolic one. The truth, finally, had a voice, and the manipulation had been dismantled. For Sarah, the conclusion brought relief and a sense of belated justice. Participating in the investigation and exposing old secrets allowed her to release the weight she had carried for years, realizing that protecting the truth was more important than the fear of reprisals. Laura, in turn, felt that her effort in exposing herself had been worthwhile. Her courage helped preserve crucial documents and ensured that the Amityville stories were told in full, respecting the nuances and complexities that James had revealed. James, at the center of it all, reflected on his own transformation. He was no longer just the curious journalist seeking sensationalism or quick answers. He had become a protagonist, capable of facing complex challenges, balancing risks, protecting allies, and leading with intelligence and courage. Every decision made, every action planned, and every instinctive reaction to danger demonstrated the growth he had consolidated throughout the narrative. The story's conclusion not only ended the central conflict, but also solidified the protagonist's arc of overcoming and learning, making his emotional and strategic evolution evident. The town of Amityville finally felt the impact of James and his allies' actions. Residents began to grapple with truths that had previously been hidden or distorted. Stories that circulated as rumors gained context, past injustices were acknowledged, and a new understanding of local history was established. The narrative showed that courage, meticulous investigation, and determination to seek the truth could transform not only individuals but entire communities, breaking cycles of silence and manipulation. With the conclusion of events, the reader realizes that all narrative arcs have been resolved. The antagonist faced consequences, the allies found justice and safety, and the protagonist reached the pinnacle of their evolution. The story ends with a sense of emotional and intellectual closure, ensuring that the efforts, risks, and sacrifices of each character have full meaning within the plot. Months later, Ocean Street seemed peaceful, but the memory of the event still lingered over the town. James continued his work, now more cautious and strategic, applying the lessons learned in the Amityville investigation to new cases. Laura followed paths that combined courage and discretion, protecting historical records that could change future narratives. Sarah found peace, knowing that her role in revealing the truth brought justice and emotional freedom. Richard finally faced the reality of his choices. The story of Amityville remained a reminder that secrets kept for decades can eventually emerge and transform lives forever. If you were intrigued by the secrets revealed in Amityville, share your impressions in the comments and tell us what surprised you most about this story. Subscribe to the channel to follow new investigations, mysteries, and accounts that defy reality. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episodes, full of suspense and unexpected revelations. We want to know your opinion. Do you believe that all the secrets of Amityville have truly been revealed, or are there still mysteries hidden in the shadows of the city? Your participation helps build a community of readers and curious people who seek to discover the truth behind the most fascinating stories.